Hello, I'm John Bandley, Editor of International Employment Lawyer, and thank you for joining today's webinar on how global employers can face COVID vaccination challenges head-on. Whether by government or corporate mandate, the requirement that workers be vaccinated against COVID-19 is straining employer-employee relationships worldwide. This strain is becoming even more acute as the world grapples with another wave of the virus and the new, more transmissible Omicron variant recently discovered. We're going to discuss all that and much more today, but before we do, there's a few housekeeping points to cover. First, please use the online question tool to post any questions you may have, and I will share these with the speakers at the end of the session. Second, if you have any audio-visual problems during the presentation, please use the same tool and a member of our team will be on hand to assist. And finally, just to note, today's session is being recorded and we will share a recording by email and on the website in the coming days. Now, having said all that, it's my pleasure to welcome today's panelists. Michael Michelandos is the head of Baker McKenzie's Asia-Pacific Employment Team. Michael advises numerous global and local clients across a range of industries on all aspects of employment and industrial law, including anti-discrimination and bullying, workplace investigations, and health and safety. We're very lucky to have Michael with us today, as it's currently very late or very early in Sydney, depending on your point of view. Meanwhile, from Paris, a much more reasonable time zone, Emma Rochler is Herbert Smith Freehill's Head of Employment for EMEA. Emma specialises in French and European cross-border employment matters. In particular, she helps clients on national and cross-border transactions and restructurings, executive terminations and hires, international mobility issues, HR management, and litigation. And meanwhile, coming to us from the crack of dawn in Chicago, Stephen Perlman is a partner and co-head of Proskauer's Whistleblowing and Retaliation Practice. Stephen's practice covers the full spectrum of employment law, but with a focus on claims for discrimination, harassment, whistleblowing, and breach of contract. Thanks to all of you for joining today. To begin with, and to set some context for our discussion, Michael, we probably don't have enough time to go through the whole of APAC, but briefly, how have governments across some of the key jurisdictions approach mass vaccination against COVID, either by mandates or incentives, and have these actually worked for businesses?
Thanks, John, and I hope I don't look like I'm approaching midnight. Generally speaking, in the Asia-Pacific region, vaccinations have been rolled out by governments on a voluntary and no-cost basis. There was one outlier. Early on, the Indonesian government mandated vaccinations for everyone over age 12, subject to some exceptions. But as time has passed, we're seeing more jurisdictions tighten the noose by mandating vaccinations in certain high-risk sectors, such as aviation, airports and quarantine, aged care facilities, hospitals and medical centres. In Malaysia, the government's only recently mandated COVID-19 vaccinations for all government employees. Some governments, though, are also making life difficult for the unvaccinated by imposing requirements and restrictions without directly mandating vaccination. So recently, for example, the Philippines government has introduced rules that employees who remain unvaccinated for no legitimate reason in places where vaccines are readily available must pay for COVID tests every 2 weeks if they're required to work in an office. In Hong Kong, the Monetary Authority and the Securities and Fund Commission have issued circulars requiring all authorised institutions and licensed corporations to strongly encourage their staff to vaccinate and to make arrangements for unvaccinated staff to undergo COVID testing every 2 weeks. Similarly, in Singapore, the government has just announced that from next year, only employees who are vaccinated or who have just recovered from COVID can return to the workplace. All unvaccinated employees will not be allowed to return unless they produce negative COVID tests. Other more interesting measures across the region include requiring unvaccinated persons to pay for their own medical treatment, cutting off certain welfare and health insurance benefits for unvaccinated persons, offering citywide discounts for vaccinated persons. Earlier in the year, the Hong Kong International Airport announced it would give away 60,000 flight tickets to people who got vaccinated before a September deadline. In New South Wales, Australia, only the vaccinated can enter a pub or a restaurant until the 15th of December. And as you'd appreciate, people have been rioting in the streets here.
Fair enough. Emma, how are you seeing natural responses across Europe, Middle East and Africa over the last few years? I mean, did those sorts of things that Michael has mentioned also chime with what you're seeing? Any particular trends or responses to the new Omicron variant that's worth noting?
Yeah, I mean, similar response across Europe to what Michael has just been telling us about for Asia-Pac in terms of the voluntary approach in most countries. There's a couple of exceptions. I'll mention one of them in a moment. So the general approach is vaccination is not mandatory other than in certain sectors. So for example, in France, in the medical sector, doctors, nurses have to be vaccinated to go to work and can be suspended, will be suspended if they're not. And perhaps you've seen in the news, there have been riots in Guadeloupe, French territory, in relation to that. So some objections to those mandatory vaccination, which is on public health grounds. But in the private sector, vaccination remains voluntary in most of the major European countries, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, etc. Obviously, in countries we have the health pass, COVID passport approach for access to services and public places. So anyone who wants to access, for example, a restaurant, bar, cinema, public space like that has to provide a pass. But for the moment, that's not mandatory at work. The government is obviously, in terms of the Omicron question, John, that you raised, the approach has not changed for the moment. So the approach is still voluntary, but obviously a big pressure now in Europe on the third booster, encouraging as many people as possible to have the third vaccination, and also discussions about extending that to vaccinating children, which I think is an important issue for employers, because obviously their employees are going to be impacted by children being, infected or having contact with infection. So I think that will be an important development for employers as we see that rolling out across Europe as well. I mentioned there was one interesting exception in terms of mandatory vaccination, and that was South Africa. So in June 2021, the Minister of Labour issued an amended direction on occupational health and safety, which permitted employers to implement mandatory vaccination policies. So in other words, an employee can be disciplined, dismissed for not being vaccinated if that policy is implemented in the company. There are obviously checks and balances on that. So it's after a period of extensive consultation with the employee reps. But what we're seeing is a lot of major companies are choosing that option. So in South Africa, a slightly more aggressive approach from employers in many cases to imposing vaccination on their employees.
Thanks, Emma. Steve, it might seem that it's an easier question for you to answer as you're just covering the US with this, but obviously 50 states aren't particularly homogenous when it comes to COVID restrictions. How have the states reacted to President Biden's vaccination mandates that came out a couple of months ago, and what are the legal challenges that OSHA's guidelines are now being placed with?
Well, there's really no uniformity within the United States. It's anything but united. And for companies that have multi-state operations, there's really a patchwork that requires them to assiduously follow the changes in the state laws. There's really pronounced disparities amongst the different states. We've seen a flurry of activities in some states, such as Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Iowa, Kansas, North Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, and West Virginia, where they've expanded available employee exemptions to vaccine mandates in response to President Biden's recent announcements championing a mandate. And the laws generally in these states allow employees to seek exemptions to mandates for reasons that really go far beyond federal law and even current state laws. So it's vexing when you try to comply with a one-size-fits-all approach. That simply isn't going to work. Take, for example, Montana. Montana enacted a law that prohibits discrimination based on vaccination status or possessing an immunity passport. Now, by contrast, you look at other states and other local jurisdictions, and you see a major disparity. They've either not offered any pushback to President Biden's mandate, or they've gone a step further to implement their own vaccine mandates. Take New York, for example. The mayor recently announced that all private sector employees in the city need to be vaccinated by the end of December, and New York is expanding its program. We've seen similar vaccine mandates in other jurisdictions, such as California, for example, with healthcare workers and school workers and state public employees. So in some, there's a patchwork with tremendous disparities, and employers need to be following changes in the law in real time, lest they're very vulnerable to tripping up by complying with the law of Alabama when they're in New York, for example. You can't do that.
And when you're looking at the challenge to the OSHA ETS regulations, it's probably easy to think of that just being Republican governors playing politics with Washington, but there have been businesses and unions that filed suit against this as well. What are their complaints with the vaccine rules?
So that's a very good question, because businesses, many have reacted harshly and strongly to the ETS, the Emergency Temporary Standard, which followed from OSHA on the heels of President Biden issuing a blanket and broad mandate. So OSHA has a history of having difficulty with getting ETSs approved. They're very ambitious endeavors, and they're fraught with risks and vulnerabilities with respect to legal challenges. More specifically, to answer your question, in order to get an ETS passed, which again is a very, very hard thing to do, I don't want to understate that, OSHA needs to show that it is necessary to protect employees from a, quote, grave danger due to exposure to substances or agents that are determined to be toxic or physically harmful. So there are many challenges from employer groups saying that this is just not a grave danger, and it's not, and COVID-19 is not life-threatening to a vast majority of employees, and it doesn't arise to the level of a harmful physical substance or something analogous to that. In addition, you always see constitutional challenges, and instead of getting hyper technical, what I'll tell you is that there's a complaint that OSHA is taking public health policy measures and shoehorning them into a workplace concern, and this is something that goes well beyond the workplace.
Right. So I think we've now got a good overview of how governments worldwide are trying to inoculate their people and keep people safe from the virus and get back to work. What are some of the biggest risks for employers for not following whatever the government guidelines are across the region? Michael, let's start with you with APAC.
Look, across APAC, there are substantial penalties for breaching government orders. In some jurisdictions, police can issue on-the-spot fines to employers. In serious cases, there's actually criminal liability and imprisonment. Authorities in most jurisdictions have the right to close unsafe workplaces, and also the intervention of regulators has also resulted in negative publicity for affected employers. In Singapore, for example, the government will regularly name and shame employers who are found to have breached COVID regulations. It's also important to remember that in my region, employers, like other regions, have a specific duty to safeguard the health and safety of their employees. This may be statutory or a common law duty depending upon the jurisdiction, and an employer could face significant liabilities if the employees or the employee's clients, for that matter, contracted COVID-19 as a result of the employer failing to follow government guidelines or failing to take reasonable measures. Australia and New Zealand have the most strict laws, and employers in those jurisdictions owe an obligation to ensure the health and safety of their staff and anyone who may be affected by their work. And that extends to the contraction of a disease. Fines under these jurisdictions can be in the millions of dollars, and in fact, directors can also be prosecuted personally if they fail to undertake due diligence to ensure that their organisation is compliant. So they actually have to get actively involved in kicking the tires on COVID measures. And sanctions on directors, aside from substantial penalties, can include up to 5 years imprisonment.
And how does that compare with what you're seeing? What are the most stringent penalties that employers can place for non-compliance?
Yeah, I think just to go back a step, perhaps in terms of the risks that employers are facing, very similar to what Michael was just saying, that the real risk is that there's an obligation to provide a safe workplace, and that's in the context of a real ambiguity as to what the government guidelines are in most countries. So what we don't have in Europe in general is a set of mandatory instructions for employers as to how to protect their employees, how to comply with that general obligation. And we have, general recommendations which are deliberately phrased generally as not being instructions or mandatory, which are pretty obvious, frankly, such as wearing masks, washing hands, keeping social distancing. So really the governments in most countries have pushed the responsibility on employers to develop their own policies. And that's also in a context, obviously, where the employers are not permitted to ask their employees if they're vaccinated. So we're in a situation where some non-vaccinated employees are working together side by side with vaccinated. The employer has a general obligation to provide this safe workplace. And in the context of the risk of heavy fines and potential criminal sanctions. So for example, John, you asked me for an example of a fine in Spain, for example. The fines can go up to 225,000 euros for violations of health and safety measures. In Germany, in severe cases, can be a criminal obligation, as it can in France as well. And obviously, when we're talking about criminal obligations, that engages the personal liability of the management teams in companies. So it's really very difficult because the employers have an obligation to protect health and safety and provide a safe place of work, have not got a general set of mandatory guidelines, are facing a very sort of uncertain approach. And they're in a situation where they haven't got full health data about the status of their employees and to what extent they need to be particularly protected, either in the case of vaccination status or any particular symptoms or conditions which could make the employee particularly vulnerable, unless the employee chooses to reveal that voluntarily. So yeah, that's the situation basically in Europe, and I think employers are having to, as has been said before by Stephen in the US, follow the situation very regularly and update their policies as necessary. One interesting point is that COVID hasn't in Europe been identified as a biological risk. So the simple fact of contracting COVID is not necessarily an automatic employer responsibility, and that's obviously because we can't identify where somebody necessarily contracted COVID either. So that's a sensible approach. But that was discussed at the beginning of the COVID outbreak in Europe as to whether or not, and it was quickly basically denounced as not being a practical solution, and happily for employers' liability risk.
It's really interesting. Steve, obviously, leaving aside the OSHA issues for the time being, what kind of risks are employers facing in states with these, I guess, fairly liberal vaccination policies, saying you don't need to be vaccinated, there are exemptions, and are there any maybe whistleblowing risks to employers?
Well, not to belabor the OSHA point, but if OSHA comes in and determines that there has been a violation, there can be north of $10,000 of fines per instance, and they can get aggregated and ultimately be destructive for small businesses. And it's a tremendous problem. There is a general duty clause that applies, similar to what Emma was aptly describing. We have a similar requirement here in the United States. With respect to whistleblowing, we have seen all forms of whistleblowing in all industries related to all types of employment-related matters just proliferate across the board. It's as though individuals have deemed themselves private attorney generals in some instances. And It is not uncommon for individuals to blow the whistle internally and externally when there is a threat to health and safety caused by COVID-19, whether it's an employer not keeping a sanitary environment, not providing PPE, not providing appropriate ventilation or plexiglass, or requiring masks. Employees are apt to complain internally, and if that is not a fruitful endeavor, to go to the government and blow the whistle to the government. In that instance, the government, OSHA, has an opportunity to bring suit on its own if an investigation doesn't resolve the matter, or alternatively, individuals can bring private causes of action in federal and in state courts under myriad legal theories, and some of these theories carry the specter of punitive damages. And so, in short, I think that we can continue to see an uptick in whistleblower complaints, and there's been a deluge of lawsuits that are grounded in retaliation claims based on somebody saying, hey, look, I complained that my employer was not providing a safe work environment, and there was retribution as a result of that. I lost my job. I need compensatory damages and back pay.
And there's also an incentive for whistleblowers as well, that they can be paid by the government for would that also apply in the instance of COVID, or was that separate, do you think?
Well, that is separate, but you never know. That may happen in the near future because bounties are becoming fashionable in the United States. You have an SEC whistleblower program which surpassed $1 billion in payouts this year. And you're now starting to see industry-specific whistleblower programs. You also have a CFTC whistleblower program. So I expect more whistleblower programs where they provide bounties to continue. None as of yet with respect to COVID, but don't be shocked if you have one in the future.
Fair enough. Something that we've been getting this question a lot in the lead up to the webinar, and obviously we planned on being asked anyway, but there will of course be people who are unable to be vaccinated due to underlying health conditions or religious beliefs. Michael, let's start. Generally, how should employers approach such requests? Are they allowed to ask for proof of conditions or beliefs in various jurisdictions?
Yeah, John, firstly, everyone needs to understand that there's very little consistency in anti-discrimination laws across my region. For example, whilst Australia and New Zealand are fairly comprehensive in their anti-discrimination legislation, these laws are, let's just say, under construction in countries such as Malaysia and Singapore. The common theme, though, is that to my knowledge, unlike some of the states in the US I've just found out, there are no jurisdictions which protect employees on the grounds of their vaccination status. There are several jurisdictions which prevent employees from discrimination on the grounds of religion, medical condition, or pregnancy, and that could give rise to a risk of indirect discrimination because it is possible that people who fall within these classes cannot be vaccinated or cannot be vaccinated safely. The theoretical possibility of religious discrimination has often been raised, but I think you'll find that none of the major religions, in my jurisdiction at least, have thou shalt not vaccinate as a commandment. There are some fringe religions which take a prayer-only approach to health management, but the risks of those types of claims are fairly low. So there's definitely an opportunity for any budding messiahs out there to create an anti-vaccine religious cult, if you're interested. The key discrimination risk does relate to people with medical conditions. However, as available vaccinations become safer, this class is rapidly shrinking. Where employees claim that they suffer from a medical condition which prevents them from being vaccinated, generally speaking, an employer may ask for medical evidence provided that the request is reasonable in light of the prevailing COVID health risks within that jurisdiction. Most jurisdictions actually have in place regulations or guidelines regarding obtaining medical exemptions. There are some privacy requirements, particularly when the information is recorded or collected, and that's because health information by and large is recognised as sensitive data. Employers need to be mindful of indirect discrimination risk, but the simple fact that an employee cannot be vaccinated safely is not a get out of jail card. In most jurisdictions, safety does come at a premium, and employers need to consider other methods to reduce the risk of contracting or spreading COVID-19 for those classes. There are also certain jobs where unvaccinated employees should not be performing, regardless of the reasons why they're not vaccinated. This may include, for example, I mentioned earlier, quarantine workers or hospital workers. And people must bear in mind that the anti-discrimination, indirect discrimination risk only arises if your condition is unreasonable. And there may be circumstances where it is reasonable. A key part, though, of justifying these decisions and seeking information is for the employer to have conducted some risk assessment of the circumstances and have evidence to establish that there is a real risk within that jurisdiction, within that workplace. That is quite critical.
And Emma, same question to you, but also how does the GDPR play into this as well? I mean, employers, are they worried about having data about people's medical conditions or religious beliefs?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it depends on the jurisdiction. In fact, generally there is a big, obviously, problem with GDPR in this sector, and obviously bearing in mind that vaccinations are not mandatory, so there's no legitimate interest in the employer raising the question with the employee as to whether or not they're vaccinated, other than in certain sectors such as healthcare, where it's mandatory in certain countries to be vaccinated, such as France. And if an employee is not and doesn't provide evidence, then they can be suspended without pay. So we're starting from the principle that no mandatory vaccination, plus big GDPR concerns as to asking for that information. And an interesting approach has occurred in Germany, which is known really for its very strong data protection provisions and GDPR compliance. And in fact, interestingly, employers now are permitted to request data about vaccination status and test results to the extent this is required to fulfill their statutory requirements. So that's a slight development in terms of what employers can or cannot ask. And we'll see how that develops in terms of how statutory requirements is interpreted in that context by the Data Protection Commissioner. I think there is a sort of common sense approach to all of this as well, in the sense that whilst there's a strong protection for data, there's also a strong interest in employers protecting their employees, the workforce, nations in general, defending themselves against this virus. So I think probably the Data Protection Commissioners are going to take a sensible approach as long as employers respect the guidelines. Similarly, in South Africa, there is actually a permission for employers to process personal information, where, including in relation to healthcare and COVID vaccination status, where it's necessary to carry out actions for the conclusion or performance of a contract. So that's very large. And that's being interpreted to permit an employer to request specific information on health status of an employee in the context of COVID. So that's sort of in line with the position South Africa is taking in general on allowing employers to impose mandatory vaccination as well. So a much more radical approach from South Africa on that.
And Steve, I get the sense that religious exemptions are quite a big deal in the US. So there's been reports of large increases in the number of employees in certain sectors suddenly claiming that they have found religion and therefore to avoid the jab. How are employers dealing with this generally?
So this issue has been politicized, and it's the source of a lot of contention. Many employees have backlashed against vaccine mandates and try to find various ways of saying that they are exempt, one of which is religion. Now, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the United States provides an exemption for a sincerely held religious belief. But what amounts to a sincerely held religious belief is the source of many battles. And employers, as a practical matter, often give questionnaires to employees, some of which I've seen are single-spaced, 5 pages long, that question and rigorously vet whether or not there's a sincerely held religious belief. They look for whether or not there's any inconsistencies with the employee's medical regimen and their espoused belief that the vaccines are not appropriate because there's fetal tissue that may have some involvement in the creation of them, for example. Now, you'd think because the EEOC weighed in that you'd have uniformity within the United States, but that's just not the case. Some states have taken a very broad approach, and they've said that you don't have to have a sincerely held religious belief. Instead, they'll defer to strongly held moral convictions and philosophical approaches too. This is all very amorphous. It's not something where you can pull out a calculator and determine a certain answer. It's subjective, and a clever employee might be able to navigate this system to their advantage too.
Yeah, and Michael mentioned this earlier on when it comes to pregnancy being in the past an exemption for the vaccination, but that seems to be changing as new studies suggest safe for those who are pregnant. So certainly in the UK, the NHS has suggested women should get jab this winter. Do any of you see a situation where an employer just won't use that as an excuse to be vaccinated? Too much of a risk to say that you're a pregnant woman, but it's safe to get the vaccine, so you should do?
Look, I speaking for Asia Pac, the focus has always been on risk levels, and as safer vaccines come onto the market, then the risk posed to a pregnant woman will decline. So I think it's going to be more difficult to run a discrimination claim if you're a pregnant employee. But I mean, in the meantime, the other notable thing about pregnancy is it is a temporary condition. So many employers have simply been accommodating pregnant women in short-term roles which have involved less exposure.
Yeah, and I think in terms of Europe, most employers would be reluctant to pronounce on that subject. You know, they wouldn't see it as something that they would encourage employees necessarily to do, given that it's not their sphere of expertise. So our general recommendation would be don't make a pronouncement on that subject to employers.
Steve, anything from your end on that?
No, likewise. I think that employers take a wide berth around this issue. No pun intended.
And of course, to get on the slightly more contentious subject, shall we say, while there are obviously people who are reluctant to get the vaccine or they can't because of health conditions, there are those who just don't believe in vaccines, the anti-vaxxers who make a lot of noise. So should an employer deal with those the same way they would deal with somebody who can't have a vaccine, or should they employ a different strategy where they can do? Anyone wants to weigh on that?
Maybe I'll start on that one, John. I would say it's a similar response to the previous question. In other words, the debate between the anti-vax and the pro-vax, most employers are avoiding getting involved in that for two reasons. Firstly, they don't have a legal right to force vaccination other than in the circumstances I've mentioned in South Africa. And also because there is an interest in maintaining the social climate and a peaceful working environment. So I think the difficulty is if the employer starts to take a position, they could be facing legal action from the anti-vaxxers under some kind of discriminatory claim, but also just from a practical point of view, will be creating or encouraging differences of views between their employees, which are not going to be conducive to, you know, smooth working relationships. So again, most employers are taking, as Steve said, a wide berth on that position, whilst still perhaps subtly encouraging vaccination by practical measures. So for example, allowing time off on paid basis for vaccination during working hours, and you know, basically facilitating the vaccination process rather than actively encouraging it or taking position on it.
Michael, Steve, your thoughts?
Look, in the Asia Pacific region, we're not seeing a different strategy at the moment by employers. A different approach may need to be taken where there's a government health direction in particular industries to be vaccinated. And health orders usually will exempt employees with a genuine medical condition, but not someone who's taken a political stance on this issue. I should note as well that in some jurisdictions, Australia included, there are discrimination protections on the grounds of political convictions, but our courts have not at this stage accepted that an anti-vaccination stance is a political opinion. At the end of the day, employers need to take a deep breath, conduct an assessment of the COVID risk within their organisation, and then take action in accordance with that risk, rather than focus on the particular reasons why a person's decided not to be vaccinated.
So in the United States, there's a common misconception that speech is protected in the workplace under the First Amendment and that political views are protected as well. Put aside a state like California that has specific protections. As a general rule, however, claiming the First Amendment to protect your speech rights, it just doesn't work if you're not at a government employer. So let me disabuse people of the notion that they can say whatever they want because they're protected by the First Amendment. And if they offend employees and employers alike, so be it. The First Amendment applies to them. Not so if you're a private employer. What do you do in this sort of a circumstance if you're an employer? You know, it's very risky to get into the mix. Right now, we're experiencing in the United States, and I know it's going on throughout the world, what we've called the Great Resignation. And, you know, many folks are simply quitting, or there's a lot of employee mobility. And this is very vexing for employers. There's a profound and acute labor shortage right now. And so getting into the mix of this would run the risk of exacerbating that problem and the risks attendant to a major labor shortage. So I'd encourage employers to be very careful if they do get into the mix. If they do get into the mix, I think that it's important to focus on positive education for the workforce, that the vaccine is really not going to pose a significant risk to your health, and you know, have somebody who is credible come and talk to the workforce and educate them, teach them, make it easier for them to understand as opposed to shoving it down their throats, so to speak. I think that those are the approaches to take, and you're going to get a little bit more with sugar here, a little bit more with the carrot than you will with the stick.
I just add on to that, we're talking here obviously about vaccination policies, but clearly the corollary of that is that employees can impose the other health and safety measures which are recommended and more visible. So things like masks, wearing masks, washing hands regularly, keeping social distancing, all of that can obviously be imposed. And the anti-vax movement, an employer would have a better chance of disciplining, for example, someone who didn't respect those kind of health and safety provisions than going into the vaccination territory.
And it linked with what, Emma, you were saying about the sort of the social contract, I guess, between employees and employers and society live in, and what Stephen was saying about freedom of speech. If somebody comes into the workplace with anti-vax material and tries to convince their colleagues that they shouldn't be vaccinated, that they have vaccinated, that they're destroying themselves and all this sort of thing. We've seen some very weird and scary things put on social media that don't seem to ring true. Is there anything that an employer can do to kind of limit that, whether it's discipline or, as Steve said, is it just merely education? We are seeing an increase in employee activism and flashpoints between co-workers. How can navigate that sort of scenario?
What in terms of the practical approach to that, because there isn't a strict legal answer, is there's a certain degree of respect for free speech, but obviously in the respect for your fellow colleagues and in the smooth operation of the company. So if an employee was very aggressively anti-vax and causing a disruption to the activity, I think the employer would really discipline more on the disruption to business rather than the position taken. So that isn't, I wouldn't exclude that as a possible action for an employer, because it's reasonable for employees to come to work. They have their views, they have the right to their views, but they don't have the right to obstruct the work or disrupt the operation of the business. So I think it's more on that angle.
Great. Steve, Michael, anything to add to that, or have I pretty much nailed it?
Look, I've got to say, I mean, most of the jurisdictions that I have to deal with, they're very employee friendly, so it's very difficult to discipline an employee over this issue. But if the employer has adopted, for good reason, a mandatory vaccination policy, or at least restricted certain roles so that vaccination is required, and you've got an employee who's undermining those efforts, in some of the jurisdictions that it actually can form a basis for disciplinary action. I mean, for example, in Australia and New Zealand, an employee who's undermining the employer's efforts to ensure health and safety can be disciplined and could actually be prosecuted under our work health and safety laws. In other jurisdictions, it depends upon the policies of the employer. For example, in the People's Republic of China, the employer would need to have a written company policy clearly stating that misinformation relating to health measures would be considered a serious violation of company rules, and have some proof that the employees received the notice of these company rules. Similarly in Vietnam. So it is possible, but it does depend upon the health measures taken by the employer and whether or not the employee is undermining those measures.
So in the United States, the answer is very similar to what Emma had provided for the jurisdictions that she's speaking of. There's very little protection in the United States for political speech if you're not a government employer. So you have to focus on the practical aspect of this too. And you can analogize disruptive behavior, business disruptions to other types of speech. Let's say somebody is walking around, you know, taking their Second Amendment right to bear arms views and disrupting other employees with that. You could imagine how, given more incendiary facts that are, you know, more black and white, an employer could have some latitude to impose discipline. Here, I'd start with education. I'd start with a softer approach. But ultimately, if somebody's being very disruptive and frightening other employees and disrupting business, discipline may very well be necessary and appropriate.
John, I could perhaps add that in some countries in Europe as well, in fact, not so much an employer issue, but generating fear and social alarm with false information, for example, about vaccines, can be a criminal offence in some countries, such as Spain, for example. So it may be that the employer could have a quiet word with the employee and say that there is a risk of a criminal action, perhaps from a fellow employee, if that situation is extreme. But I think it remains the case that it's dangerous to create disruption in the workplace by taking a strong position on the anti-vaxxers.
Okay. I'm conscious of the time that we need to be getting to the Q&A portion of the session with our audience, but before we move on to that, I'd like to know if you give employers in your respective region one key piece of advice now to help improve vaccination rates within their organisations, what would it be? Michael, let's start with you.
Look, I think Stephen's already touched upon it. It is important to educate your employees, but also to consult with them. And in particular, if you do have employees who don't wish to vaccinate, it's important to speak to them, hear their concerns, try and understand their reasons, consult with them about the risks posed to them, to their colleagues, and to your business. And also, I referred to it before, but it is important in our jurisdictions to conduct some kind of risk assessment and to explain to the employees why the particular risks in your organisation may require higher vaccination rates. However, a lot of employers are providing employees incentives in our jurisdiction. That's included time off to receive vaccination. additional leave for vaccinated employees. And more recently, we're seeing clients offer to close the office earlier for Christmas Eve if the office vaccination rates increase.
Emma, what about you?
Similar to Michael in terms of the incentive approach, so not providing financial incentives or benefits, that's not a tendency in Europe, but facilitating in the sense of allowing time off paid to get vaccinated within fairly generous parameters. So for example, a period of 3 hours in France to enable the employee to do a return trip to wherever they need to get vaccinated. And that has gone down very well with employees and the employee reps. I think anything more in terms of financial incentive or benefits would be considered as the employer taking a stance on the issue and probably would provoke more criticism or would be seen as a more political approach. So we tend not to see that so much in Europe. But definitely my advice would be facilitate. If you want to encourage your employees to be vaccinated, make it as easy as possible for them. In some companies, obviously, there's presence of a company doctor, the company organizing the vaccination access to vaccines, which can help as well, both in terms of reducing the time off necessary. So having a nurse attend the premises for those who want to go get vaccinated, for example, could be a practical solution.
And Steve, stateside, what do you think?
Okay, so I asked this question to a very sophisticated client of mine. She does happen to lean very far left. And she said, look, you know, if people didn't get vaccinated by this particular point in time, it's not because they're lazy, it's not because they're ambivalent, and it's not because they don't have access to pharmacies and resources. It's usually because they have a political stance on it. So mandate it. Now, if you mandate it in the midst of, and it seems rather draconian, if you do this in the midst of the Great Resignation, you have a risk to your productivity, and there's a parade of horribles to having a massive labor shortage. So I think that Michael and I are aligned when it comes to education. Assume that your workforce is intelligent enough to either appreciate the risks or be taught the risks and make informed decisions. I don't think that you're going to persuade the harsh anti-vaxxers, but there might be some folks who are a little bit scared. They hear things on the news that might lead them in one direction that the employer thinks is really not the scientific approach that they should be taking. So I'm in favor of education.
Maybe I'd just add.
I got it.
Sorry.
No, go on.
John, as well, that we obviously the position is changing all the time, and it may be that in certain countries in Europe we're actually going to be seeing mandatory vaccination programs in the spring. In Germany, for example, it's being talked about. In South Africa, it's already implemented following consultation with the social partners. So it may be that employers will actually have the decision taken for them in the near future.
I think just briefly. Go on, sorry, Michael.
I was going to say in the last 6 months, many large organisations across my jurisdiction in Australia have conducted anonymous surveys of their staff on this issue, on the adoption of mandatory vaccination policies. And it surprises me that the vast majority of employees, and I haven't seen results less than 85%, have shown a fairly strong and vocal support for mandatory vaccination in their organisation. They're actually quite apprehensive, if not fearful, of mingling with the great unvaxxed in the office. And that sounds surprising in a liberal democracy, but I mean, you need to bear in mind that one of our states holds the record for the longest period of lockdown. So people are terrified of being locked down again. So it is important that employers do consult and also gauge the views of their own workers and take that into account in their approach.
And for global employers, where perhaps they are able to incentivize in some jurisdictions or not others, is there any risk to them that they might have employees in, say, Europe going, hang on, you're giving, you know, our colleagues in the States or in Australia extra time off and, you know, paid incentive to do things. What about us? Why are we being discriminated against? Is there any risk of that coming back to bite employers with vaccinated?
I think there's no legal risk. So obviously what you provide to employees in one country, you're not legally required to provide similar in another country. But from a social point of view, if there's communication globally, certainly the social partners, the works councils, the trade unions could start to ask for similar measures if they see that their colleagues in other countries are having benefits. So I think the global employer would need to look at how their employees interact, whether there is a cross-border communication, particularly perhaps within Europe, to see how that might have a consequence larger than the one country envisaged.
I guess moving on to the Q&As, we've got a few that's come in. First of all, we've talked about religious exemptions to vaccinations, but what about religious objections to testing, such as lateral flow and PCR tests? Is this something that an employee can argue that they don't have to have those done? Anyone have a take on that in their various jurisdictions?
Perhaps I'll mention just for Europe, obviously in our countries at the moment, we don't have mandatory vaccination or tests to come to work. So an employer is not permitted to do that other than in certain limited sectors such as healthcare and certain other very limited areas. So the fact that an employee refuses to have a test would not particularly be a reason to restrict them from coming to work, because the employer is not required to check.
We're seeing the opposite in our jurisdictions, that a lot of governments, rather than mandate vaccination, are in effect mandating testing in relation to certain risk areas. We're also finding employers seeing testing as the softer option as opposed to mandatory vaccination. But at the end of the day, too, in most jurisdictions, employers need to show that the testing is reasonable, having regard to the risks in that jurisdiction. And in some jurisdictions, like some states of my country, there have been no cases of COVID-19, but in others there've been many. So it does depend upon that risk analysis.
I think the other issue is, of course, testing as a financial consequence. In many countries now, the testing is no longer free, government provided. So employers perhaps have a financial impact if they were doing that.
So in the United States, based on the ETS and pronouncements and comments from the government, testing is plan B. Getting the shot is plan A. And so there's little concern about imposing the cost of testing. Some may say it's de minimis, but it's a cost still to employees. It's the less invasive option, and the EEOC is comfortable with imposing testing too. So I think employers will have little to no trepidation, and more will have no trepidation about requiring testing if somebody is not going to get the shot.
We've had a few versions of this question, so I'm going to try and amalgamate them into one. So if there are unvaccinated employees within a business and an employer provides them with the ability to work remotely to fulfill their health safety obligations, could vaccinated employees assert a claim that there is discrimination because they are perhaps not allowed to work from home? And also, does the employer have to provide working remotely chances to every employee in this case?
I've got to say that the studies in my region suggest that working from home may be here to stay, at least from a hybrid perspective. We're seeing larger numbers of employees seeing working from home as desirable. And in circumstances where we have the big resignation, I think employers that don't adopt some type of workplace flexibility will have issues in terms of retaining and attracting employees. So regardless of the legal issues, it is going to be an important issue. We are seeing a fairly significant change, I'd say, workplace revolution as to how work is being conducted. And I do think this flexibility in many jurisdictions is here to stay.
In the United States, I don't think that there is an immediately apparent cognizable legal cause of action for that type of disparity. Let's look at it with sort of a negative view. Somebody's gaming the system. I don't want to get vaccinated because I want to work from home. Well, how is that fair to me as a vaccinated, conscientious employee doing what the employer wants? I have to go into work. It's very difficult to muster any sort of a legal claim based on that. And the contrary view is that there may be some risk that folks who work from home might not ascend as quickly or easily within a company as those who have more visibility because they're on the ground rubbing shoulders with people who are in the office. But that's something to think about down the road. There could be gender disparities as well.
Yeah, and for Europe, obviously, we have the equal treatment principle, which is a European directive, which means that you can't treat people in the same position differently. But again, to go back to the point that an employer can't ask if an employee is vaccinated or not, and can't require the employee to be vaccinated to come into work. So the simple fact that someone is not vaccinated wouldn't entitle them to have a working from home, teleworking agreement necessarily. But all that in the context of equal treatment, and also to go back to the point of just creating a sort of social climate which is harmonious, which will always be important in dealing with this kind of request.
Are there any other challenges, juggling that employers are having to deal with between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated we haven't discussed so far? Any issues of discrimination, for example, or harassment even between employees? Anything that we perhaps haven't touched on yet?
Well, I think there's one other thing to consider, that there is an exemption according to EEOC directives in the United States that if you have a medical condition that prevents you from getting vaccinated, that you're exempt. And if somebody, now that's a tough row to hoe. That's a difficult thing to prove. It really is. Some have even gone so far as to say, well, what about anxiety for wearing a mask, or what about, just an allergy that you have to the shot? It's a pretty difficult standard to meet in the United States. But if somebody does meet that standard and they are harassed for taking that exemption, they are apt to bring a claim.
Emma and Michael, anything else?
No, on that particular.
Similar to. Go on, sorry.
I was just going to say, on that particular subject, no, we haven't at the moment. But again, it's pretty early days. Probably we haven't seen a lot of harassment claims. More perhaps in the domain of health and safety. So I can well imagine someone who's sitting next to someone who's not vaccinated and who happens to know the person's not vaccinated could well say that the employer is putting their health and safety at risk in not taking some kind of action to prevent that situation arising. So I think that could be a real risk.
I was just going to say, similar to Stephen, that, well, firstly, in some of the jurisdictions, the tide appears to have turned quite aggressively against the unvaccinated, and we are seeing some fairly strong views being ventilated against unvaccinated employees. Now, where those employees can establish that the reason for their vaccination, the reason for not being vaccinated is a medical condition, then it is possible to run a discrimination or harassment claim, and I suspect we'll see a lot of those in the coming year.
Okay. I think that's pretty much all the time we've got for today. I think we could still go on this for a while, and we are still getting a few questions in, so perhaps we can put those in an email to our speakers to perhaps respond to post session. Thank you for taking the time to be with us, Steve, Michael, and Emma. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Really insightful stuff. Just remind everybody that the webinar is recorded, and we'll share this recording in the coming days. So if you weren't able to get your question across or you missed part of it, there's time to rewatch whenever you want on demand. I also know, as a number of the speakers have said throughout the session, this is an ongoing, fast-moving topic. To help you with this, IEL does have its new ways of working tool, which talks about the different jurisdictions' guidance to home working, vaccination rules, etc. You can download your reports for free online, and particularly countries that apply to you and your workforce. So please give that a look. Again, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in another webinar soon. Thanks a lot.